Hello dear viewers and welcome to a new book review on the Alexis and Arabia and Beyond channel. Today we're going to have a look at Lords of the Desert by James Barr. The book highlights the frustration of American diplomats with the British management of Middle East affairs and goes into much detail on what was said to whom and when in meetings. This book is a must-read for anybody wanting to get a full understanding of the recent history of the Arabian Peninsula. This is a topic with incredible potential, considering there exist reports of a 2-hour American versus British proxy war over the oil fields on the what was to be Saudi Emirati border in 1947, which cost the lives of a total of 3 Saudi and Emirati soldiers. An excellent book for the lovers of the minutes of meetings and great detail. Intro. Lords of the Desert focuses on the British-American rivalry over the Middle East after the First World War and especially after the French departure from the region. The book explains how the British initially wanted to maintain control of the Middle East to continue the passage of ships and goods between India and Britain, all developed into priority only at a later stage. The French and the British needed the USA to continue their influence over the region. However, the Americans were careful not to seem complicit in the European mismanagement of the Middle East. But while the Europeans were more intent on exercising political power, the Americans were more interested in commerce, as it offered more realistic options and allowed relations to be more flexible. The Americans also introduced the idea of splitting economic profits 50-50 with the Saudis, something the British refused to do, as they feared this could trigger resistance, such as the nationalization of oil companies. The British also made the miscalculation that the USA would go back into isolation after some involvement in the MENA region to support the European allies. This would prove fatal to British dominance over Arab states. Topics. Lords of the Desert is divided into topics which explain the gradual shift in political and economic priorities, as well as the dominance over the region by the French, British and Americans. It starts by explaining the effects the Americans had on the MENA region when they arrived and how the Europeans reacted. I will touch on all these only briefly so as to not give away too much before you read this interesting book yourself. Beginning of the end. The American approach to the newly developing world order was that there was no room for the traditional concept of empire after 1918. Records detailed in the book show how shocked the USA was that the British did not adjust to a changing world. Old order. Americans were also having to cope with the British and French blaming each other for developing instabilities and the sources of conflict. Irreconcilable interests between the three caused additional problems, especially as the Europeans focused more on their struggle over the Levant. The Americans also noted that the Arab population was left out of the accumulating oil riches, which could lead to sources of instability. Heading for trouble. The book details, through recorded conversations between diplomats, politicians and businessmen, how the Americans had to deal with the obstructive nature of the British, which could have been worse had the latter fully understood the true level of American interest in the MENA region. Oil. Records indicate that the Americans were interested in Saudi oil to rebuild Europe after the world wars, and that American oil was to be stocked for the case of a war against the Soviets. But despite initial intention to keep any American involvement in the region on an economic level, the USA soon experienced the need for strategic thinking, which meant becoming politically involved in the MENA region. This was also required when distributing wealth to the Saudis and managing an environment of competing pipelines bringing oil to Europe. The role of explorers. The book also touches on the importance of European explorers as they established initial contacts with local tribal leaders. This experience would prove vital when determining possible future political partners for cooperation and which rulers to support. Removal of rulers. To establish their influence over the region, Britain had to enter into agreements and partnerships with local Arab leaders. For the British, accepting American support meant losing their monopoly over the MENA region. American companies were quick to establish themselves in the area, but the US still preferred to maintain a covert approach when it came to increasing their influence so as to not upset their partnership with the British. However, information on the scale of American involvement was leaked and caused the British to maintain the image that their monopoly will continue. This also meant ensuring that any local rulers were always favorable to them. But the Americans also worried that a hard approach by the British on Arab states and rulers would eventually drive them towards the Soviets. Defending the rulers. The passage of shipping and goods through the Arabian Gulf was of utmost importance to the British, so defending local Arab rulers favored by them from internal and external threats was essential. This was especially the case in Kuwait and Oman. Failure to protect these rulers meant that they might seek American protection from threats such as rebels. Ironically, the British at the same time also had concerns that rebels may seek US assistance, which could further increase American influence in the region. Epilogue. James Barr explains how even without the growing American influence, Britain would have found it hard to maintain its monopoly and hold over the MENA region. Pan-Arabism, Arab nationalism, and oil embargoes proved too costly for Britain, and socialist movements meant the British would also have to deal with the Soviet Union's and China's influence as well. This would prove too much for Britain, especially after recovering from the turmoil of World War II. In the end, Britain focused on key areas where their influence had been of great benefit to local rulers and their populations through entering into protection agreements with them, such as in the Trucial Coast Emirates, which were later to become the UAE. The importance of this Pax Britannica will be discussed in a later video on this channel. But while Britain no longer enjoys a monopoly in the region, some relations have stood the test of time, especially those with Oman, which remains the first and the last strongest ally of Britain in the Arab world. So this concludes our review of Lords of the Desert by James Barr. Our next book will be Built on Sand by Sebastian Sons. Yes, it is a German book, and I'm not sure when an English translation will be available, but the book provides a very detailed picture of the Saudi state and its society, and how Europeans, especially Germans, could conduct their bilateral relations with the kingdom to benefit all involved. Subscribe to the channel and see you in the next episode. Till then.